Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ECITB's first virtual national forum. My name is Sally-Ann Garrard-Hughes, Head of the Regional Operations, and before we begin the seminar, I'd like to go through some housekeeping items. All attendees will join automatically with their cameras off and their microphones on mute. The orange arrow at the top of the control panel allows you to hide or expand the panel. The audio settings should be set automatically to computer audio, but it's worth double checking this. As we have a significant number of people on the webinar, please ask questions via the question box in the control panel. If you type your question and press send, the question will go straight to the organisers. No other participant will see it. If we happen to run out of time regarding answering the questions, a written response will follow. I wish to advise you that we will be recording the session, so if you have any difficulties watching this webinar, a copy will be available on the website later today. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to our CEO, Chris Clayton. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name's Chris Clayton, and welcome to the first ECITB National Forum. It's good to see so many of you on this forum. I think we're up to 120 and growing by the second, so that's really good news. And we've got employers from across Great Britain and representing all the different sectors that we work with. We've also got a number of our board members on this forum, so they'll be able to hear all those questions and any issues that come up, as well as our council members and regional chairs. And so I look forward, and I hope you get a good opportunity during this forum to hear a few of the messages that we've got, but also to then ask the questions that you want answered as we go through. And after this, we'll clearly then go into breakout into our regional forums starting at about 11:30. So as for 2020, I think it'd be fair to say that most of us were glad to see the back of 2020. In terms of the impact on the engineering construction industry, it was a mixed picture. For some sectors, such as oil and gas and EDP, it was particularly difficult with large-scale job losses. A few sectors saw an increase in work, but for the majority, it was a difficult year. As it became clear that lockdown would be necessary, the ECITB designed and implemented a package of support measures, and they were grouped along three themes. The first was back to work support, and the Train to Retain initiative was the centerpiece of this package, and you'll hear some more about this scheme shortly. The second was maintaining the new entrant pipeline. As we saw apprenticeships fall significantly, or apprenticeship starts fall significantly, we devised a scheme to pump prime the system, the scholarship. And we currently have 215 scholars and ITECs under training, with about a further up to 180 odd due to begin this year. And the final theme in the package of measures was around accelerating transition, which saw a focus on our digital support measures, online training, direct learning support, a blended learning approach. And we also increased our work on energy transition and net zero. The drop in learner numbers for 2020 was a pretty fair reflection of the wider picture. CCNSG numbers were 64% of where we expected them. And ECITB licensed product interventions were 61% of our target. And apprenticeship starts fell by about 40%. On a brighter note, the number of graduates on our support program exceeded our planning assumptions by 20%. But in terms of training expenditure, our pre-pandemic budget plan was £24 million for the year on grants. And the actual grant expenditure for 2020 has been £22 million. And from the picture we initially saw in March, this has significantly exceeded our expectations. So a lot of training has taken place, and the money not spent in 2020 has been allocated to the 2021 training budget. And you'll hear a bit more about that later. So lessons identified. I suppose it's too early to be definitive, but we've seen quite a big shift to online and blended working. We've worked with a number of employers to convert some face-to-face training into e-learning. We've increased the number of our products available online, and we have a program to continue that work in much more detail, as well as initiatives around the Connected Competence Scheme and making that fully digitized. The second one is that clearly the recovery is going to be is through building and the pivot to net zero. However, there is very much a big gap between the statements the government is making about net zero and the emphasis on infrastructure and shovel-ready projects. So for us, it's how do we maintain skills in the industry until the work comes in. We have now developed a blended learning strategy, which will build on the early work that we did last year to bring a much more extensive program of learning to the industry. Of course, face-to-face training is an absolutely vital component of that, but there is much more that we can do through online and other mechanisms, simulation and emulation as well. So looking to this year, well, from conversations with a number of employers over the last couple of weeks, I think the mood can best be summarized as cautiously optimistic. This is not universal, but broadly across the industry, order books are starting to fill, and there is optimism that this year will see substantial improvement. The mood amongst training providers is not quite as positive. While most of them have managed to switch theory training online and keep their students training, workshops are still closed, and the backlog of practical work is mounting. This is likely to mean that there is a bigger impact on vocational and technical education than other types of education, with potential delays in completion of courses and apprenticeships. At the regional forums that follow this meeting, we'll discuss support for the next 12 months. And in providing additional support for this year, but also to identify future initiatives and to try and influence some of the government's work, we'll be doing some significant pieces of evidence gathering this year. One major one, which you're going to hear about shortly from Andy Brown, is the census. And on the net zero action plan, we're going to work on two major pieces, which is the what is required and the how we're going to help deliver skills. And as part of this work, one of our board members, Jane Cooper, is on the government's Green Job Task Force and providing input to that task force on behalf of the engineering construction industry. I'll finish with a couple of opportunities and concerns from the skills perspective. The impact from the pandemic on learners in technical and vocational education, as I've already said, is likely to be significant due to the backlog and practical work. There's a potential impact, therefore, on availability of new entrants to the industry over this year, and much will depend on the capacity of the training system to reduce that backlog over the summer months. And we're working with train providers on how we can help support this. The government published its skills white paper last month, and I think there are some good initiatives in that paper, but they will take time to implement. And it's not yet a whole of education approach. I mean, currently a 14 to 16-year-old who want a more vocational education enter an ad hoc system, which does not really prepare them for the choices at 16. This is in contrast to those heading for higher education, where the pathway from 11 is really clear. So we're working with DfE to see how the announcements made in the skills white paper can be turned into a practical approach to build engineering pathways in technical and vocational education. And in doing this work, we are well aware that the government's push to a skills system being more and more employer-led seems to have happened whether or not employers actually want it. While some, and they're often larger employers who have the capacity, are keen to be involved and are very much involved, others don't have the time or the capacity to engage. And so I see a key role for the ECITB will be to represent the views and needs of all our employers into this work. I suppose a clear deduction for the ECITB is that much of our focus to meet the growing needs of the industry for net zero will need to be on upskilling and reskilling for adult workers and the in-place workforce. So supporting industry prepare for net zero remains the single biggest opportunity for the engineering construction industry, but it is equally important that we balance that with an enduring focus and a really sharp focus on the now to ensure that employers have the skills they need as the country starts to come out of recession. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I I'm going to take over now, and I'm hoping my colleague Roy will be able to bring up some slides which I've prepared, and there they are. Thank you very much, Roy. Well, good morning all. My name is David Nash, and I am Director of Strategy and Policy at the ECITB. And I'm going to spend a few minutes now just giving you a brief update and overview on the 3-year strategy, which some of you will have, many of you will hopefully have seen that we published an update to the strategy back at the start of January. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through what that update looks like before handing over to my colleague Andy Brown, Director of Operations, to talk you through a snapshot really of our priorities for 2021. Before I start, I'd just like to say that if you are wanting to ask questions, as Sally Ann said at the start, please do ask them through the chat, and there will be a segment at the end of Andy's segment or session to answer those questions before we move on to the next session. So Roy, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. So as you hopefully all know, back in August 2019, we published a new 3-year strategy for the ECITB, which we called Leading Industry Learning. And this was really developed in close consultation with you. We held workshops across all of our regions and sectors, and had extensive dialogue really with industry, training providers and governments in both Westminster and the devolved nations to really get views on what should be our priorities for the coming 3 years. As I said, we published a plan in August, and really the strategy sort of set out 4 main challenges that we saw that were facing the industry at the time. The first was what we saw as a growing competition for engineering skills. The government published documentation setting out plans for £600 billion worth of infrastructure investment over the course of the Parliament, and we could see competition coming from other sectors and other major projects such as HS2. The second major challenge was demographic change. We know we have an aging workforce in the industry, and according to our own analysis, 14% of the workforce is due to retire in 2026. So this need to bring in new talent to support the skills needs of industry really is important. The third driver is obviously technological change, and in particular the impact of Industry 4.0 and the digitalization of business and industry processes and the implications of that for skills is really important. And then fourthly, and this shouldn't be said enough, but is often overlooked, the importance of maintaining a safe, productive and competent workforce is really at the fore of our strategy. And we set this out, as you hopefully all know, in terms of 3 strategic pillars: the foundations, which is really the bread and butter of what the ECITB does, our levy and grant system, our standards, meeting the current skills needs, which is really what it says there on the tin, and also preparing industry for the future and preparing the workforce for future skills requirements. That was then, back in August. Fast forward 6 months and we find ourselves in March, and really at the height of the pandemic. And this really, of course, is the context for the review. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, as Chris has covered some of it, but as you all hopefully know, back in May, we launched a £14 million crisis response package for the industry that was focused on 3 areas. The first was the retention of essential skills. We saw a lot of concern out there that obviously in large parts of the industry, particularly oil and gas, where COVID hit at the same time as the collapse in the oil price, we saw real pressure on headcount, and it was really important for the ECITB to do all we can to support the retention of particularly early stage skills, so apprentices, graduates and trainees. And the main initiative that we launched, as you know, was Train to Retain. Last year we supported 530 learners on that programme, and as Andy will articulate shortly, we have plans to extend that scheme this year. The second really is to stop the decline in new entrant numbers. Last year we saw a year-on-year decline in the number of new apprenticeship starts by 39%, and for graduates the figure was 30%. So our initiatives here are really an attempt to maintain that pipeline of new talent coming in, and the main scheme there was the scholarships program, as well as a short duration or compressed ITEC scheme. And the third really was, as Chris said, how do we support industry prepare for the recovery and accelerate this transition? And there are really two focal points to that. The first is all about remote training and assessment. And as Chris said, we've done some work there already last year, looking at digital assessment, for instance, and there's more to come this year. And then finally, the transition to net zero clearly has major implications for the industry, and I'll come back to that point. But suffice to say, when the board decided to review the strategy in the summer and autumn of last year, we clearly wanted to reflect the work that we'd done in response to the crisis in our strategic plan, because, you know, in our view, none of those initiatives were 6-month initiatives. These initiatives are going to be important over the medium to long term too, and so it's really important that we reflect these initiatives into our strategy. Next slide, please, Roy. So the board reflected on the drivers of change underpinning the strategy, and if you wouldn't mind clicking, perfect, thank you, Roy, as if we've done this previously. There were 4 main drivers of change in the original strategy. Those 3 there I've talked about, so I won't go into any more detail. To suffice to say that they're still very much prominent in our strategic thinking. Industry 4.0, that was in the strategy previously, but there's been a subtle shift in our thinking. And previously we were thinking mainly about the impact of Industry 4.0 on industry processes and what that meant for skills, and the need to see a greater number of workers with basic requisite digital skills, but also advanced digital skills. The pandemic has changed our shift slightly. That is still really important, but equally, as we've all seen, the pandemic has accelerated a shift to remote working, and so how we deliver training and assessment has to also change, and we are seeing increasingly a move away from traditional face-to-face learning. That is still very important in some cases, but increasingly you will hear us talk, and you will hear industry talk about blended learning and remote learning and assessment, and so that is a real key driver for us going forward. And then a new driver that the board decided that we needed to add clearly was the transition to net zero. This is a long-term project, clearly, with goals out to 2050 to fully decarbonise the economy, 2045 in Scotland, and it will have major challenges but also opportunities for the industry. There will be opportunities in technologies such as hydrogen and CCUS, and we need to make sure that our workers have the skills to be able to harness those technologies. Could you move to the next slide, please? So these are the 3 main pillars of the strategy, and I think on reflection, the board felt that broadly speaking, the strategy is still fit for purpose and on track. I'm just highlighting a few slight changes in those pillars. So the first really touches on what I've said just now about digital and blended learning, and that is all about how do we improve access to quality training. The second subtle difference, as you see there now, is the addition of net zero and developing the workforce for net zero as part of our work to prepare industry for the future, albeit of course that work is happening now. And then finally, the board took a view that actually diversity and inclusion and how we support our industry to diversify its talent pool and also be more inclusive as an industry really is at the core of everything we want to be doing as a training board to support you. So we've moved that issue to our foundations. Next slide, please, Roy. So as part of the 3-year strategy, we also publish a 3-year business plan, and in light of the update to the strategy, we've also revised the business plan, and you will see a snapshot of the business plan, which Andy will talk about shortly, in the strategy update document on our website. That strategy update also includes new performance indicators for 2021, so you can see how we are measuring our performance through the year. And as I say, you can find that document on our website at ecitb.org.uk. That is it from me. So I'm now going to hand over to Andy Brown to talk you through a snapshot of our priorities for 2021. Andy.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everybody. Great to see such buoyant numbers joining our forum this morning. What I want to do is highlight those areas in 2021 that we aim to deliver to support our strategy and to support you in the industry. Going through them in no particular order, supporting the post-COVID recovery. So as David mentioned, we're going to commit a £9 million to Train to Retain delivery in 2021. We'll continue to deliver at least to the end of this year with some new elements to Train to Retain. We will be extending the funding cap. So if you have found that you've got people currently being supported and by the end of March, they're within 30 days of that funding support being ending, then you'll be able to apply for an extension to that support. We will also be providing support for new graduates and apprentices who've been recruited in 2020, and as I say, support approved learning plans will be valid through to the end of the year. The account managers have got the details and will be dealing with their points of contact directly, but we'll also be updating the website on the details of Train to Retain extension. It's important that we keep focus on the low numbers of new entrants, and so we'll have additional funding for more scholarships. We're aiming to recruit a round of scholarships in the middle of the year to focus on specific disciplines, but also a generic round later in the year on the 2-year program. When we think about new entrants, we are working with government so that we can see how our programs interface with the national program. So if you've got learners, or we have learners on a scholarship, how they can fast track into an apprenticeship with the minimum interruption, and how the funding will work for paying for the apprenticeship is an important piece of work that we need to get agreement with government. And when it comes to the competition for skills, the support for the Hinkley Point support operatives, this isn't just a project specific level of support. Those new entrants into industry through that support operative program and through the developmental programs that we've developed with the project will mean that we will have more people in the industry for future projects, which will help address some of the issues around competition for skills. I mean, when it comes to competition for skills transferability is really important, and it can be counterintuitive that if you make your workers more transferable, then arguably you're at more risk of losing them. But if we make people more transferable, it means we can have a more efficient flow of workers across the industry, which will help keep the costs down. It means people are more ready or more able quicker to move into various projects. So we'll keep progressing connected competence against the revised connected competence strategy that was revised last year in response to the downturn. And we will work with industry to develop an all-energy transition technician program. When it comes to working towards net zero and energy transition and supporting the industry to develop the skills that they need, it's a key part of our strategy that we map out what's needed by industry for the future, for a net zero carbon economy. So we map out what's needed. We map out and provide information to employers about what is already available, and we're working with HE partners and employers to develop a higher education postgraduate program for energy transition leadership. Diversity and inclusivity is now sitting in the foundation area of our strategy, as you've seen, and we will embed training standards into our relevant training programs so we can ensure we're getting that messaging across to all of those learners. But we'll also leverage an approach to diversity and inclusivity where we can through our network of providers, making sure that we can recruit into industry a more diverse cohort of learners. And to do that, we're starting early on our tendering activity for the 2021 autumn scholarship recruitment. and that will give us better chances of trying to reach a more diverse group. Our labour market intelligence continues to be the absolute bedrock of our decision making, and so the workforce census that we'll deliver this year is absolutely critical to that. This will help us build an up-to-date picture of the workforce and skills requirements. It'll enable us to better understand the skills gaps and demands and shortages to meet those demands. It'll help us target skills provision. It'll help us invest in our training provider network to make sure we can do that. And it will help support transferability and mobility and hopefully suppress wage inflation. We're currently out on some pilot field work that's underway with a small group of employers, and we will be inviting other employers to participate in the programme at the beginning of March through to the end of April. I can't emphasise enough how crucial this work is. If we're going to make the right decisions with your levy money, then we need to get that input and really have robust labour market intelligence. And that accuracy of data, we can really target our offer more effectively and also lobby government more effectively on your behalf. In other areas, supporting the adoption of IR4, we're focused on digital skills and how we can improve our industry offer through a blended learning approach. And this really builds on some of the virtual training delivery that we supported in 2020. And finally, continuous improvement will remain a priority. Jenny's going to brief you on the customer satisfaction headlines after we've had a question and answer session. And we also want to support our improvement of our training providers, the ability for our training providers to provide virtual delivery solutions and face-to-face solutions where there's a requirement to invest in facilities. So they're the headlines for 2021. I wanted to go through that quite quickly because I'm conscious of time and the need to provide a few minutes for questions. So Sally-Ann, if we can move to any questions that we've received during that last 20-30 minutes. Thank you.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that has come through from the panel is, will the Train to Retain funding be available to 2021 new starts? That's one question that's come through. Another, what are you doing to support blended learning? So a little bit more information about that if possible. And the third one, are you doing anything to help employers refresh the skills of workers coming back to work from furlough? So that's three that we've got in at the moment.
Okay. At the risk of hogging the answer panel, I'll definitely start with the Train to Retain question around 2021. At this point in time, we've extended the new entrant recruitment for 2020. I think we need to look at the demand for 2020, look at the demand for the extended requirements for those that are already in support, and then take a view on whether or not we extend it to 2021. Graduate recruitment normally starts in the summer. Obviously, apprenticeship recruitment starts a bit later than that. So while there will be pockets of employers who are making recruitment plans now, absolutely, we've got a little bit of breathing space. Give us an opportunity to look at what the commitments are under these revised criteria before we then go to the board with an extension on 2021. I will also answer the back to work element as well, if that's okay, at risk to colleagues of hogging the space. That was definitely a requirement of our board at the last board meeting, that we need to think about people coming off furlough. We need to think about those year 2, year 3 apprentices who have likely be suffering skill fade. And we also need to think about those year 1 apprentices and scholars who are currently out of the training centres as well. So we are pulling a plan together to support a back to work programme. The challenges are, of course, that everybody that's furloughed have got different skill sets, different disciplines. We're clearly not going to be able to provide a bespoke programme for every single occasion. So we're out to industry at the moment to get some feedback on what industry thinks is required. And we've got planning meetings scheduled for the next couple of weeks and a proposition to put to the board at the March meeting.
Yeah, and part of that as well, and it's going to be working, isn't it, with training providers to see how we can help them get over the backlog of those apprentices and others, because that's going to be a challenge affecting the supply new entrants into the industry.
I think there was another question, Andy, on what does our blended learning strategy look like and what will it contain? I think you're probably best placed to answer that one too.
Yeah. So again, we've kicked off the development of this strategy. The early sort of headline plan is to have, as the title suggests, we were always going to have face-to-face training. How much of that face-to-face training can we deliver in a virtual environment? How can we take from core face-to-face and deliver in a virtual environment? How much of the knowledge and theory requirement can we deliver in a virtual environment? How much training and knowledge training can we access through federated models with content that's already available? So it's about looking at that whole spectrum. We know that what we might call operational performance standard, there is definitely a delta between training and an employer's requirement to get people up to that level. There is then also a delta below that must include face-to-face training when it comes to skills-based training requirements. It's what we can do underneath that to have a more effective and more efficient delivery system. So
I think it's, as part of that, we absolutely recognise the multi-speed of the industry. I mean, some sectors, some employers are really well advanced on this work themselves and are a long way forward. Others, it's a different requirement, and they don't have the means and access to get to that same space. So the strategy we come up with has to work across the landscape of the skills needs, but also the differing needs of different size of employers, and where they're at with their skills development, with their online skills support as well. So it is genuinely a blended learning. The board is very, very focused on the fact we've got to make sure that we stay focused on the now as well as the future, and deal with the whole spectrum of the skills that are presented to us.
Sally Ann, do we have time for a couple more?
We've got time for a few more, if that's okay. They're coming in thick and fast, so I will pick some for you. So will the grant amounts be reviewed and amended based on the move to more blended learning, is a question that's come through. The second question, are we setting targets for recruitment on scholars, etc., in relation to aspects of diversity and inclusivity? We know we have a gender imbalance at present, so are we setting targets in that area? The second one, the next one is, are you going to take into account the furlough recovery against wage costs when you calculate levy, as effectively an employer wage costs are lower, but if furlough offset isn't considered, we'll be faced with higher levy costs next year? So a levy related question. And another levy related question we've got is, how is the census information different to the levy return? And that's for now, if we carry on with that, and then I've got more questions coming in. Thank you.
So if I can answer the grant related question on blended learning, there will inevitably be an impact on the grant structure and portfolio if there is a change in how training is being accessed and how training is being delivered. Obviously, what you could see is we might invest a significant amount of money in systems to enable learner-driven and employer-driven access to training. That means that it potentially could be free to access. Therefore, there would not necessarily be any grant attached to that type of training. But it's very much early days into how that will land, because, as Chris said, there will be such a variety of offer that the grant review will follow as we roll out our blended learning offer to industry.
I was just going to come in on
the rest of the questions. David, why don't you take on the D&I targets?
Yeah, I think D&I targets as part of the next scholarship cohort. That is certainly something we'll be looking at. Obviously, it's not been applied to the current cohort, but as Andy said, we'll be making preparations for the autumn cohort over the coming months, and that is one consideration. Too soon to say, I think, at this stage, as to whether or not we'll put in force sort of mandatory targets on providers, but it will come out of a dialogue those providers too. The other point I think was a question on is the census information the same or similar to the information that employers or levy payers have to declare through the annual levy declaration? And the short answer is no. It is looking at specifically workforce data, a broader range of workforce data, to allow us to understand in more detail what types of occupations and disciplines employers currently have and where there are pinch points likely to be in the future. So it is not just a static look at what's going to be, what is currently in your workforces. It is an attempt to help us understand where this might be going in the future. So it is more sort of more rounded in its approach than the return. And I have to say, despite that, it shouldn't be a long exercise for employers to take. We've spent a lot of time working on the survey questionnaire. Franziska von Blumenthal in my team is leading on that work, and we're piloting this now with employers. So your participation is really crucial, but it shouldn't be a long commitment for you.
It's always that balance we've got to find between asking questions and getting the information, the evidence we need, and we understand that coming out to you and asking for surveys and information is difficult because it takes time and effort to complete. But we're doing our best to minimize the amount of times we do it. But this is a really important element of the evidence building process. And it will inform a lot of work that not just that we do, but it will inform the work that government does and has influence on how they look at the skills side of it. There was another question there about does furlough count in terms of levy assessments. And we've put that question back into the department, but our understanding is that yes, it does, because furlough is an emolument and therefore it counts as an emolument and therefore counts in terms of levy assessment. I appreciate that won't be a very popular message, but we're waiting for definitive guidance on that from the department, which they'll get from the Treasury, but that is, as far as we understand, the position as it stands at the moment. Okay, have we got time for more questions, or do we need to move on now? We're just conscious that it's we're in the last. I think if we
can we move on, and then possibly if we've got time, take some more at the end. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, I think so.
Move over to Jenny then, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, my name is Jenny Young. I'm the Head of Strategy, Policy and Insights, and I'd just like to spend 5 or 10 minutes taking you through a summary of the headline findings from the satisfaction survey that we ran in autumn last year, and also explain what steps we're now taking in response to those findings. So the first thing to say is there's been a 5-year gap since we last ran a satisfaction survey. This is largely due to the fact that there were consensus rounds in 2016 and 2019, and in the intervening period between those 2 points, we'd initiated and then implemented quite substantial governance changes. So there was a fair degree of flux going on internally. So to coincide with the launch of the Leading Industry Learning Strategy that David has talked about at the start of 2020, we took a conscious decision to focus more explicitly on measuring the impact of our work sort of over the 3-year strategy period and beyond. And this is not just the transactional outputs that we deliver, but also trying to look at the deeper and longer term impacts that we have on outcomes across the industry. So if you like, trying to answer the so what question, which is often a lot harder. And as has been talked about, 2020 was dominated by the effects of COVID, and this is undoubtedly reflected through the results and the feedback, but we've still got a very valuable set of information from you. So I'd firstly really like to say a big thank you to all those who responded amongst all the other really significant operational challenges that we know you faced last year. We surveyed 3 populations, in-scope employers, providers and approved centres, and then other stakeholders, which was a varied group, including clients, trade associations, government departments, local enterprise partnerships and local government, and third sector bodies. We had over 200 responses overall and a 37% return rate overall, which we were very pleased with. These charts just give you an overview of the respondents. So the left-hand chart shows the spread of response across those three populations, whilst the middle and the right-hand charts give you a sense of the employer spread and return by region, and also by some of the key characteristics, such as levy payers and employer size. So we have been able to do some analysis of subsets, but only where the populations have been large enough for sort of subset analysis. That's something I'll come back to later. And for the employers and providers populations, it's worth noting that the respondents were the primary engagement contact of our account managers, provider account manager, or external quality assessors. This next chart shows the headline key performance indicators from our 2020 business plan that relate to the customer satisfaction survey. So 3 of these relate to immediate skills priorities. These are looking at addressing skills gaps and shortages, accessible training, and the product suitability of ECITB products. And 3 of them are focused on more on longer term strategic priorities, such as the value of our labour market intelligence, how we're helping you prepare for net zero and digitalisation from coming out of the industrial strategy, and also influencing government skills policy. I won't go through all of these. You will receive obviously the recording, which will have the slides in afterwards. But in each case, the darkest centre wheel is the 2020 target. The middle wheel is the actual achievement that we measured through the survey. And the outer lightest wheel in each case is the 2021 target. But it's just worth highlighting that actually all the key performance indicators here were met, and we've set our 2021 targets to stretch our performance in each area. But this is obviously just one high-level view of the survey. What I'd now like to do is drill down, looking at each survey group in turn briefly, and some of the headline figures for each of those. So looking first at employers, these are very good scores across the board, really. And I think these reflect the strength of both the account management relationship that we have with you, and also the strength of the levy and grant model in addressing market failure. And those were both comments that came out of the survey. We do recognise that the 57% there, the lowest rating, and a lot of the specific comments were made against the usability of the MSP system. I'll come back to that later. And looking at the plot on the right, I appreciate the text there is small, but this is just illustrating something that we asked each survey group population, asking about the importance of our strategic objectives, and then how effectively we delivered them. And these plots show the relative ratings of those, so not absolute figures, but relative ratings. And it's worth noting that across all 3 groups, all the objectives were viewed as either important or very important. There wasn't anything that fell below that measure. Whilst effectiveness ranged from neutral to effective across all the objectives. We can certainly see that those strategic objectives that related to longer term, less tangible areas were seen as being delivered less effectively by you. So that's something that we're exploring in more detail. Although in many cases, this was because the respondents didn't feel that they knew enough to be able to give a rating. And that's something that we're picking up in the action plan that I'll come to at the end. The next population is the providers and approved centres. So again, the same sort of breakdown. You can see that the approved centre scores, again, are very good. The provider scores are slightly lower by comparison. It's already been commented on that providers were hit particularly hard by COVID restrictions, and although many were swift to move to some training online, workshop closures impacted hands-on training delivery throughout 2020. And these factors were undoubtedly reflected in many of the responses, particularly in the desire, the 37% you can see there, the desire for greater marketing and support from ECITB. Of all the 3 surveys, the provider responses particularly highlighted a real appetite for being consulted and working more in partnership with us. So that's something that we're already acting on. We've held a number of provider workshops during January as a first step to understand provider needs in more detail. And the final population is the other stakeholders. So again, as I said, this is a very varied group of respondents from lots of different types of organisation. The main point that's worth highlighting here is that the effectiveness of the longer term strategic objectives and the strategic value were very highly rated by this group, much more highly rated than for employers and providers. We suspect that this difference may in part be due to the fact that for employers and providers, the respondents were more the learning and development focused contacts who are our main day-to-day points of contact, whereas for the other stakeholder groups, they tended to be more strategically focused individuals within those organisations. So that may well be a factor in that regard. So what are we doing now? Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Obviously, there is an awful lot more detail in the survey findings than I've presented in those 3 charts. So the directors across the whole organisation and their teams are reviewing those findings in detail and formulating action plans, which will be shared back with the board. And then obviously throughout the course of this year, we will put those plans into action and measure the impact and progression when we do the second year of customer satisfaction again in around the autumn time of this year. And this will be a continual cycle for the next 4 years. And I'd like to wrap up by just highlighting some of the areas of improvement that we have identified. We obviously want to concentrate our action to give maximum impact with our available resource. So for employers and providers, we're probing into any variations that we can see in the detailed data. So whether that's variations around employer size, region, sector, or even particular training products that are being used. So for example, across the board, the responses generally relating to technical tests or CCNSG show that notably lower scores compared to other products. So that's an example of something particular that we're investigating. As I said, we're looking at building our relationship with providers as key collaborative partners and providing more support to them where we can. And this in turn will increase the availability of training opportunities for employers. Communications was a recurrent theme throughout the survey. I think quantity was rated as most respondents were happy with the quantity of communication, but we are committing to look at the quality and efficiency and sort of the two-way nature of communication with all our stakeholders, and also addressing that disparity between short-term and long-term strategic objectives. We want to do a couple of particular things. So looking at communicating what we're doing more visibly and articulating the value of our longer-term strategic activities more clearly, and also communicating how we use our research to drive our own action and decisions and also our influence back into government. I mentioned MSP, which came up in the employers and providers charts, and a lot of the specific comments in the survey related to MSP, so we recognise that there's an appetite for improvement. I should say that we're very conscious that this is a custom system that's evolved over several years, and for an IT system, it is fairly old, aging now, and its use has been extended to multiple purposes. So in the immediate term, we're going to be promoting the use of the MSP training videos to try and support and increase the usability of the system. And in the slightly longer term, we'll be working with and supporting the board as they consider whether more comprehensive action and IT investment is something that's appropriate to look at the overall grant and learner management experience, and that relates to the blended learning strategy that we've already alluded to earlier on. And finally, for the questionnaires themselves, we'll be looking at improving the questionnaires in the future, particularly around trying to reduce the length of questionnaires, seeing where questions haven't added value to the feedback this time round, and encouraging greater response across all groups so that we can do more nuanced analysis in future years that's not been as possible as widely as we would like so far this year. So that's the overview. I think Chris, David and Andy are going to join again, and if there are any further questions beyond those we've already had, we'll take them now.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions coming in. So one of them, you haven't done a customer satisfaction survey for 5 years. Why are you running it every year now is one question. I have another question. Are there any plans for the CCNSG safety passport to be available to be run remotely to prevent unnecessary travel during COVID? So if I take those two first, and then I've got a couple more coming through as well. Thank you.
Okay, so if I take the first one, you know, I mentioned why there's been a 5-year gap. I think the thing we're conscious of now is that there have been a lot of recent changes in the external environment. I mean, COVID last year, Brexit, which we're still seeing the effect come through as energy transition as a topic and an impact plays out, and then political changes, seeing the levelling up agenda that the government is keen to push, as well as things like remote operations. So I think we recognise that the board are going to review the strategy every year and fine tune it. We're also trying to become more agile as an organisation to respond. So I think we see that the customer satisfaction survey is an important quantitative tool to give us hard evidence to help check continually that we're providing value to employers in the best way that we can.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think the CCNSG question, I think, Andy, you're probably best placed to answer that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So in the here and now, CCNSG is available through virtual delivery. So that's a COVID-19 social distancing response, conscious that our providers are not able to have large cohort sizes or large enough cohort sizes in their classrooms, and so it's an intervention to keep training going. That means that we're very much doing a handheld test, creating a handheld sort of test environment on a Friday morning, which is very staff intensive. And so the further iteration of CCNSG will be, as part of our blended learning solution, will be to look at how much of that can be delivered virtually. Now, this is quite an interesting example because there's a significant proportion of the industry really value the face-to-face interaction that time in the classroom provides on the 2-day passport. But we've got to look at how much of that can be delivered maybe as pre-learning. So the facts and figures and some of the regulatory side could be delivered as an e-learning, and then it can really reduce the face-to-face commitment. And then can that face-to-face commitment be delivered in a virtual environment as effectively, with lessons learned and people providing, you know, real life experiences, or does it still have to be in a classroom? And then we need to find the right test environment to assure the validity of the tests. And we've got a couple of options. One of them we're using for connected competence, and the other one we're using for, we're looking to use for knowledge tests for the awarding organisation. So we have got options that we're looking at.
Thanks. And I gather I was a bit hard to hear on the last session. Apologies for that. I shifted my microphone out the way. So if any of the previous questions that I answered weren't clear to you, do let me know. I just reviewing back through the questions, I have noted that there is quite a strong theme in there about making sure that train to retain is there for the 2021 starters, and that's noted. We've got board members on this meeting as well, and then they'll note that and we'll have that discussion. But clearly, for us, the budget is the issue. I mean, ideally, we would say yes, it is, but we need to know how much money have we got to balance against this program, against the others. And it's not necessarily easy to do. So, for example, some of the money allocated last year has been deferred into this year because the uptake wasn't as big as the initial demand profile would say. That was a good thing. It was an insurance program. It enabled people to recruit with confidence or keep people with confidence. And we appreciate that has had an impact and effect. The problem we've got to balance is, well, actually, how many of those people deferred into this year will use that amount of training budget that's been allocated to them? So the people already on the scheme, and then with the other changes we're making, what will that use? And then what's left to then deliver train to retain in 2021 for new starters in 2021. So it's not an easy immediate response from us, and those are the reasons behind, but we'll go back with the board, we'll look at it and see what we can do as early as we can. we're getting pretty close to the end here. I don't know if there are any final questions, Sally-Ann, which are ones we should really
I think one very quickly, and then one will be, will you be bringing back direct funding? I think if we could answer that, and then somebody's asked in the questions, could they have a copy of the slides? So just to reiterate, the video will be available on the website and the slides are incorporated within that, but if you do require a copy of the slides in their entirety, please contact your account manager and they'll be able to provide them for you probably from later today. So if I just pass that question over, will you be able to bring direct funding back, and then we're over to yourself to close. Thank you, Chris.
If I could pick up on that one, Chris, if that's okay. What is interesting in the first 2 months of this year is actually training activity, looking at the amount of training courses, ECITB approved courses, including CCNSG, that have run to the end of January and that are booked through to the end of March. The numbers are quite high. So training activity, as opposed to where we were at the start of the pandemic last year, training activity is quite buoyant. That doesn't mean to say that the direct funding of training should not be considered, and Sally-Ann has got a proposal for us to review. But you do have to bear in mind that the direct funding of training was extremely resource intensive for all of the staff, not just the regional teams, the processing staff, the finance staff. And if we're also managing normal training activity levels or close to normal training activity levels, then it could be that we're a bit resource constrained in being able to do both. So we will look at it. It's a very politician's answer, I'm sorry, but we will look at it and consider it.
Can I just make one final point just on the census, which I failed to mention earlier in response to the question, but the other thing we're hoping to do with the census is gather good site data. So rather than focusing purely on the employer or the establishment, we'll be able to build a view of what is happening at a project level on particular projects across particular sites. So that is something that we haven't been able to do previously, and that should really help us in building that picture of skills pinch points, both at a regional level but also across projects.
I think it's worth mentioning, David, as well, that we now sit on several major project groups and skills planning groups, NNB for both HPC, Sizewell, Bradwell, SMR. We're also very engaged in the industrial cluster work, and the census work is so critical now. In the past few years, we've not had the major projects in the industry that we really need to be able to get effective long-term planning on the skills requirements, and that needs us to see where the skills availability is. So it's just an additional request that to really support the effectiveness of the skills planning for these major projects, the census is absolutely critical.
Great. Well, thank you to all those who presented, and but a bigger thank you to all of those who logged on, and we've had a good level of attendance, which is really pleasing. I hope you found this informative. Now, what we're going to do next is go into our regional forums and almost effectively go into our breakout rooms and pick apart some areas in more detail. And I think what I'd really value at the end of this exercise for those who are able to do is a little bit of feedback to say, well, actually, has this forum worked? By having a national forum and then moving into the regional ones as a session, is it a more efficient way of delivering? Is it giving you what you want and need and the access you need to people when you do it? And there are many more options which we could consider, but that would be really helpful. So thank you very much. I hope you have found some useful information on what we've had, and we've got some clarification. We've certainly got some issues to take away with. The board has been listening, as has the council has been listening to those issues, which I think is also helpful. And I look forward to catching up with, I think I'm joining Scotland in the regional forum at the end of this, but we'll catch up with some of you very shortly. And thank you and goodbye. See you later.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Chris. So we'll take a 50-minute break and then we'll reconvene in your regional forums. If you haven't got the information, please contact your account manager and they'll be able to give you the information. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.